Picture this. It's 1995, and two martial arts legends are about to cross paths in the most unexpected way. Steven Seagal, riding high on his action movie success, strutting around a Hollywood party like he owns the world. His ego has grown as large as his latest box office numbers, and tonight he's about to make the biggest mistake of his career. Across the room stands Chuck Norris, quiet, humble, minding his own business. But Seagal sees an opportunity to assert his dominance, to prove once and for all who the real martial arts king is. What happens next will become Hollywood legend, a story whispered in martial arts dojos for decades. Because sometimes the quietest person in the room is the most dangerous. And sometimes when you push a legend too far, you discover exactly why they became a legend in the first place. This is the night Steven Seagal learned that respect isn't earned through boasting, it's earned through character. The Beverly Hills mansion was alive with Hollywood's elite. Jerry Bruckheimer's annual summer party, where A-listers mingled with studio executives and million-dollar deals were sealed over champagne. The year was 1995 and action movies ruled the box office. Steven Seagal entered like a storm. Fresh off Under Siege 2, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed his own press. At 6 feet 4 inches, with his trademark ponytail and dark sunglasses, worn indoors naturally, Seagal commanded attention wherever he went. His Aikido training had given him a fluid, almost predatory way of moving, and tonight he was hunting for validation. "Steven, the studio heads from Paramount want to meet you," called his agent. "They're talking about a 3-picture deal." Seagal nodded curtly, his ego swelling. 7 successful films, countless magazine covers, and a mystique that had audiences believing he was as dangerous off-screen as on. In his mind, he wasn't just an actor. He was the embodiment of martial arts mastery. As he glided through the crowd, Seagal's eyes scanned the room like a predator. That's when he spotted him. Chuck Norris stood quietly near the grand piano, talking with Jerry's elderly mother. He was dressed simply in a navy blazer and jeans, no flashy accessories. His famous beard was neatly trimmed, his posture relaxed, almost humble. To most people, he looked like any other successful businessman enjoying a quiet evening. But Seagal saw competition. Chuck had been reluctant to attend. At 55, Walker, Texas Ranger, was making him a household name again. But fame had never driven him. His 6 world championships, decades of training, his service to others. These defined him, not red carpet appearances. "You should go, Chuck," his wife Gina had insisted. "Jerry's been good to you." So here he was, having just finished discussing World War II with Mrs. Bruckheimer, when he noticed someone approaching with the swagger of a gunslinger entering a saloon. Steven Seagal cut through the crowd with purposeful intent, his dark eyes locked on Chuck. Several guests sensed the shift in energy, conversations quieting as Seagal drew closer. "Well, well," Seagal announced loudly, his voice carrying that distinctive slow cadence. "If it isn't the Texas Ranger himself." Chuck turned, extending his hand with genuine warmth. "Steven, good to see you." Seagal looked at the offered hand too long before accepting it, his grip deliberately firm, testing. Chuck's handshake was steady, the grip of a man comfortable with who he was. "I've been staying busy," Seagal replied, his voice carrying an edge. 7 films in 5 years. Not bad for someone who actually knows martial arts, wouldn't you say? The comment hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Nearby conversations stopped, sensing conflict brewing between 2 titans of action cinema. Chuck's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Not anger, but disappointment. "That's quite an accomplishment, Steven." Seagal's ego was like wildfire now, feeding on the growing audience's attention. He could see people forming a loose circle, phones discreetly positioning, conversations dying as all focus shifted to this unexpected confrontation. "You know, Chuck," Seagal continued, his voice growing louder, "I've always wondered what it would be like to train with someone from the old school, back when martial arts was more performance than practical application." The insult was surgical, designed to cut deep. Chuck Norris had built his reputation in the ring, facing opponents who could actually fight back, earning his black belts through sweat and blood. But Seagal was suggesting it was all for show. Chuck felt the familiar sensation from countless fights, the moment when an opponent reveals their true nature. Instead of rising to the bait, Chuck did something unexpected. He smiled. "The old school taught me that the strongest fighter is often the one who never has to fight," Chuck replied quietly, his Texas drawl soft but carrying clearly through the silent crowd. Seagal's eyes narrowed. This wasn't the plan. He'd expected defensiveness, chest puffing, a verbal sparring match he could dominate. Instead, Chuck's calm response made Seagal look like the aggressor, which he was. "That's a nice philosophy for someone whose fighting career peaked in the 70s, Seagal pressed, his voice carrying a mocking edge. "But some of us have evolved beyond tournament point sparring. Some of us deal with real violence." The crowd was dead silent. This wasn't just professional rivalry. This was personal destruction, and everyone knew they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years. In that tense moment, Chuck's mind flashed back to a conversation with Bruce Lee over 20 years earlier. They were sitting in Bruce's backyard after a grueling training session. "The biggest enemy of the martial artist isn't the man who wants to fight you," Bruce had said. "It's the man who wants to prove he's better than you. Because that man has already lost. He's fighting himself, not you." Chuck had carried those words through 6 world championships, through his Hollywood transition, through decades of success and failure. The man before him wasn't his enemy. He was his own worst enemy. But something deeper stirred in Chuck now. The same feeling he'd had facing opponents who mistook his quiet demeanor for weakness. They had all learned the same lesson eventually. Chuck stepped closer, closing the distance. His movement was so subtle that most observers didn't notice. But Seagal noticed. Suddenly, the Hollywood tough guy found himself looking up at a man who seemed to have grown larger without changing position. "Stephen," Chuck said, his voice quiet but carrying something steel-hard underneath, "I think there's confusion here about what constitutes real martial arts." The party had gone completely silent. Even the catering staff stopped working. "You see," Chuck continued, his eyes never leaving Seagal's, "a real martial artist doesn't need to tell people he's dangerous. People just know." What happened next would become Hollywood legend. Steven Seagal had pushed Chuck Norris too far. Chuck didn't raise his voice or make threats. He simply moved. In one fluid motion, Chuck stepped forward and, with the gentlest touch, placed his hand on Seagal's shoulder. To observers, it looked almost friendly, like a brotherly pat. But Seagal's reaction told a different story. The Hollywood action star suddenly went completely rigid. His face showed something no one had ever seen before: genuine fear. Chuck had applied a pressure point technique, not enough to cause harm, but enough to demonstrate exactly how helpless Seagal was. The technique created a sensation impossible to resist without years of specific training. "The thing about real martial arts, Stephen," Chuck said conversationally as Seagal stood frozen, "is that it's not about looking tough. It's about control. Control of yourself. First and foremost." Siegel's eyes were wide, sweat beading despite the air conditioning. He tried to move, but every attempt only demonstrated more clearly how outclassed he was. The crowd watched in fascination as Steven Seagal, the man who'd cultivated an image of invincibility, was rendered helpless by what looked like a friendly touch. "And when you have real control," Chuck continued, "you realize that the strongest thing you can do is choose not to use your strength, unless someone mistakes your kindness for weakness." Chuck held the position for exactly 10 seconds, long enough to make his point, short enough to maintain dignity. Then he released the pressure and stepped back as if nothing had happened. Seagal stumbled slightly, his face flushed with embarrassment. The cocky swagger was gone, replaced by the posture of a man who'd just discovered he wasn't who he thought he was. The silence was deafening. Camera phones had captured something far more devastating than a war of words: the complete and public humbling of Steven Seagal's carefully constructed persona. Chuck straightened his blazer and smiled politely. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm calling it an early night. Jerry, thank your mother for me. She's remarkable." He turned to leave, then paused and looked back at Seagal, who was still processing what had happened. "Steven," Chuck said gently, "real strength isn't about proving you're the toughest person in the room. It's about making sure everyone else feels safe when you're there." And with that, Chuck Norris walked calmly toward the exit, stopping only to shake hands with friends, as if he hadn't just delivered the most legendary comeuppance in Hollywood history. Behind him, Steven Seagal stood in the center of a crowd, trying hard not to stare. His worldview shifted. The man who tried to prove his dominance had instead proven the opposite, that true power doesn't announce itself. True power simply is. The story spread through Hollywood like wildfire. Steven Seagal, who'd built his career on projecting invincible toughness, had been brought low not by violence, but by quiet confidence and masterful restraint. In the weeks that followed, Seagal's behavior became notably more subdued. The swagger remained, but tempered by knowledge that somewhere was a man who could humble him with a gentle touch and well-chosen words. Chuck never spoke publicly about the incident. When asked, he'd simply smile and change the subject, embodying the philosophy he demonstrated. True martial artists don't need to relive victories or prove worth through stories. But the lesson echoed far beyond Hollywood. It became a reminder that strength isn't measured by noise or intimidation. Real strength is found in restraint, in choosing kindness over cruelty, in lifting others up rather than tearing them down. The most powerful people are often the quietest ones, those who have nothing to prove because they've already proven everything that matters, to themselves. They understand that respect isn't taken by force. It's earned through character, maintained through humility. In a world that confuses volume with authority and aggression with strength, Chuck Norris reminded everyone of an ancient truth. The greatest victories are won not through combat, but through wisdom to know when combat isn't necessary. Because the person who truly wins is the one who makes everyone else feel like they've won too. And sometimes the kindest thing you can do is show someone exactly who they really are. Not the image they've constructed, but the person they have the potential to become. The strongest people are those who win battles we know nothing about, and the wisest warriors are those who never have to draw their sword.